Well, hello there. Welcome to a lecture from my home on the topic of Hegel. And I'm sorry that I won't be able to present in the fashion in which I write on the board. I could prepare a PowerPoint to accompany this, but as of this evening, I just don't have time to do that. So I'm going to post this without a PowerPoint. Maybe I'll add a PowerPoint later. But this is a lecture on the topic of G.F.W. Hegel, and it is a lecture to accompany the handout that is available on Learning Suite. And essentially, this lecture will follow the format of what is set out in that Learning Suite handout. And you can think of that handout as a kind of set of lecture notes. So the topic tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon, or whenever you're looking at this, is Hegel. Uh, First of all, Hegel is a German philosopher who arises in the wake of the world that has been left to us by Immanuel Kant. And Hegel belongs to that school of young philosophers who is reacting to the philosophy that has been um, that has been left by Kant, and their reaction is very severe. They want to reestablish a new kind of way of looking at things that Kant seems to have um, created an opportunity for bringing about. This new school is going to become what's called German idealism. And it's worthwhile to note that Hegel is probably worthwhile to take a look at for a few reasons. First of all, Hegel is absolutely crucial for understanding Marx. And Marx is, I think, we'd have to say that Marx still has an importance in terms of the content of what he offers to us. Hegel is also important because he is going to be the starting point of a school of philosophy that is going to take hold in Great Britain and in the United States that we refer to as British idealism, and that particular class of history needs to be understood only in terms of what they develop from out of Hegel's philosophy. Now, this is important for understanding a few American philosophers. Thoreau, for instance, I think, and Emerson, and the New England Transcendentalists, I think, are going to be belonging to this school that is affected by the German idealism and some later American philosophers as well. It's also important to realize that this has an effect on some aspects of political philosophy. So, for instance, the famous um, political philosopher Michael Oakeshott, who is probably the most preeminent of nearly contemporary conservative thinkers, was trained originally in the school of British idealism. And part of his claim to fame is being a philosopher of history. And in being a philosopher of history, and in fact, across the board, his early philosophy is simply modeled on the idea of Hegelian idealism. That's also true of another philosopher of history, Collingwood, and Collingwood is going to be also quite important as a figure who does have something to say about politics. But Oakeshott, I think, if we're looking for somebody who is giving a strong position of conservatism in the nearly contemporary era, I think he died in I don't remember, 1992 or something like that, maybe 1994. quite a while ago from our perspective, but in the nearly contemporary era, then Oakeshott is really going to be an important figure, and he is heavily influenced by Hegel. Hegel is also important because he is going to launch a kind of reaction among the British idealists, most specifically Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, who are going to be reacting. Their original training is within the field of British idealism, and they are going to be reacting strongly against that upbringing that they have endured, and they are going to launch a new direction, and that is the direction of analytic philosophy. So there are a lot of good reasons for considering Hegel. I don't think, though, that we can really make good sense at all of Karl Marx without saying something about Hegel. Now, this lecture, I think I'm going to post for 2 classes, one of which is a political philosophy class, and one of which is a history of philosophy class. And so there's going to be some things that I have to say about epistemology for Hegel. And we're going to start out talking about Hegel's his connection with Kantian epistemology. Hegel follows the earlier German idealists Fichte and Schelling, and he is going to reject Kant's notion of things in themselves. Remember that Kant thinks that there is a world that is exterior to us, but we can't really ever know what that's like, because when we come in contact with that world, we always filter our ideas about that world through the categories of the human mind. There's lots of sense data, so to speak, coming into us, and the mind is going to categorize that according to certain categorical pigeonholing, so to speak. One of these categories, you'll recall, and this is an important category, is the category of cause and effect. Remember that Kant really wants to answer David Hume on this very issue. Hume seemingly undermines science by suggesting that cause and effect understanding is not based on reason. And that seems to Kant to undermine the position of Sir Isaac Newton and of the modern science that is getting off the ground at the beginning of the Enlightenment. And so Kant thinks that David Hume is leaving philosophy in a crisis, and he wants to give some kind of an answer to Hume on cause and effect. And so his answer is, of course, in terms of the synthetic a priori. There are these statements that we can make. We'll call them synthetic statements. In synthetic statements, the predicate of the sentence is going to add more information than what we have in the subject position. Now, where do we get that extra information? Well, there are 2 possibilities for Kant. We could get it a priori, or we could get it a posteriori. If we get that extra information a priori, well, let's talk about a posteriori, or a posteriori first. If we get that extra information a posteriori, we're taking that information in through the senses. A posteriori means that it is not independent of experience. So that extra information is coming to us as a result of the experiences that we have. If, however, we're getting that extra information a priori, it can't be coming to us from the senses. And so what we're suggesting is we've got a little bit of extra information coming from somewhere, and it's not coming from sense experience. And what Kant's suggesting is that that's coming from the very structure of our mind, that the very structure of our mind suggests additional information, and the function of that information is to process the raw data that we're taking in through the senses. So we go out and we look at the world and we see, a bunch of colors in, to use Kant's language, our sensory manifold. Um, and what we're going to do is we're going to take in these colors, and the mind is going to take these colors and it is going to associate or put these colors into such an ordering that we understand them as individuated items, but not merely as individuated items. And here's what's important: beyond individuated items, they are items that are in relation with each other. And one important relation is that they are in a cause and effect relation. So I have a bunch of sense data that I take in. It's a bunch of different colors. One's a red thing. It happens to be a vehicle. And one's a blue thing, and it happens to also be a vehicle. And there's a collision, and the red car hits the blue car, and the blue car ends up in a telephone pole. And we understand that we're going to apply the category of cause and effect to this sense experience that we are taking in. And the mind is going to supply that category of causation to our sensory manifold. Well, there is this objection that comes right almost immediately after Kant dies, and it comes from a kind of disciple, or at least a person who had formerly been a kind of disciple of Kant, and that is from Fichte. And what Fichte suggests is that Kant has an inconsistency, or at least it seems like there is an inconsistency if it's the case that what Kant is claiming is that our sensory experience is caused by something that is out there, outside of ourselves, that Kant refers to as things in themselves. If it's true that these things in themselves give rise to or cause our sense experience, then Kant's got a problem on his hands, because what he also suggests is that cause is merely a phenomenal application. That is, it is a category of the mind, and it pertains only to phenomena, not to things in themselves. So if he is in that position, then Kant is suggesting both that cause and effect is not in the world of things in itself, and that it is in things in themselves. And this is straightforwardly an inconsistency. And so what Fichte does, and what the German idealists follow him in suggesting, is that this category that Kant has set up of things in themselves is a canard. It is not real. That the only kind of reality that we must concern ourselves with is phenomenal reality. What we really need to pay attention to is the phenomena that presents itself to us as experience. Hegel is going to follow along with this outlook, and he is going to say that the structure of knowledge has to be embedded in what we experience, what we're conscious of alone. And epistemology for Hegel is going to become something that we might refer to as phenomenology. That is, the study of the structures of the conscious mind, of conscious experience. We're going to pay very close attention to our phenomenal experience and see if we can learn something from that. So for Hegel, we've got this overarching idea of something that he refers to as consciousness, and we have to say a bit about what this is supposed to mean. And I will be very frank. I think that Hegel is quite obscure on what this notion of consciousness is supposed to be. In fact, I think that Hegel is very obscure on lots of things. He may be the most obscure philosopher of all times, but we'll see if we can sort of machete through his ideas and get to the heart of what he has going on. In any case, what we're going to concentrate on is consciousness itself, because there is no external reality that is going to matter in a kind of things in itself modality. But Kant, interestingly, is going to talk about a kind of supraconsciousness, that is, a consciousness of which our own consciousness might merely be a manifestation. So consciousness for Hegel has three different levels. The first level is the lowest level, and that is mere sense awareness. And with this mere sense awareness, there is just a kind of, as I say on the handout, a deluge of raw data that is coming into us. You can think of just how much sense data there is. Very often I say, think about the sense data that you're taking in, that is the tactile sense data, that is what you feel with respect to the texture of your clothing against your skin. We have all of this kind of really mind-bogglingly large amounts of sense data that we are taking in all the time, and it would seem like that the mind is simply going to be overloaded with sense data if we don't do something that is going to categorize it, systematize it, process it in such a way that we can make it easier. And so, for the most part, I suppose that the category that the sense experience of the tactile feeling of my own clothing against my skin goes into is the garbage can mode. Most of the time, my mind is just simply going to ignore that in favor of other sense data that seems to be salient at the moment. However, there are those times when I will have some kind of a breakthrough of my, tactile sense experience of my own clothing against my skin. Sometime when it becomes irritating to me, it's going to begin to strike my notice. But for the most part, the sense data that we take in is just too overwhelming for our own minds. It's also meaningless. Hegel says it's silent in speaking to us. There is nothing about it that we can say constitutes sense. In order for us to bring that sense awareness up to at least initial category of knowledge, what we need to do is apply a category. And here Hegel simply is following along with Kant. Although I think that there is some difference, but he is going to suggest that sense data on its own just is meaningless until we apply, or until the mind applies some category to that sense experience, and then it becomes perception. And as we enter into this perceptive awareness, we first come to the starting ground, so to speak, of what's going to count as knowledge. Now, that's not going to be ultimate knowledge for Hegel. Hegel is going to say that the best kind of knowledge, the highest kind of cognitive activity, the most important kind of consciousness is going to be self-consciousness. And it's not only going to be the highest kind of consciousness for us as individual consciousnesses, but it's also going to be the most important aspect of consciousness for a kind of supra-consciousness that is the consciousness of what Hegel refers to as the absolute. Now, here's what happens in self-consciousness. We might think that what self-consciousness is that we are reflecting on the operations of our own minds. That's the way that the British empiricists had used the notion of reflection, as if self-consciousness is, I take notice that my mind is doing certain things, and I learn from these operations. I think that Hegel has that in mind in part. But when he talks about self-consciousness, what he wants to think is that when we turn our minds inward, we're turning our minds inward on the very categories that we're using to systematize and process our raw sense data. That is, the very categories that allow for us to undergo perception rather than raw sense awareness. And what we realize is we become conscious of that these categories are constructs of our own minds. And so our minds, our consciousness is turned back in on itself. That is, I realize that the avenue of all my understanding is in consciousness itself. And this is important for Hegel. I began to kind of dialectically make a movement, and I'll say more specifically about what I have in mind with this concept of dialectic or dialectically. We dialectically go back and forth between our self-consciousness and the categories that are the constructs of our minds to have a kind of forward progress. So that's Hegel's version of how we ought to adapt epistemology in light of Fichte's attack on Kant and things and the idea of things in themselves. So this is a purely idealistic notion of epistemology. And remember that what we mean by idealism is that reality is constituted by the ideas in the minds of perceptive entities. If we are perceiving something, it is thought to exist. Now, consciousness and self-consciousness, and here I'm just reading off of the handout that's available. Consciousness and self-consciousness bring us to understand that the mind is an individual manifestation of something that is larger than itself. And Hegel refers to this larger entity of consciousness as the absolute. And it is something that is a kind of cosmic consciousness. It's important to realize, and this plays out strongly, powerfully in Hegel's political philosophy, that Hegel really does not have the same respect for individual persons that I think that we find in say, Kant or in Locke. An individual consciousness is going to be a manifestation of something larger than itself. And it's not just that the person that's consciousness, the conscious entity is going to be a part of some greater consciousness that's this cosmic world soul or whatever it is. It's also the case that the individual is a component part of something larger than herself in the family. The family is larger than the individual person, and in the community, and most especially and poignantly in the state, in the political state. But let's talk a little bit more about this notion of the absolute. Again, this is consciousness at the cosmic level. We might think of this idea of the absolute as God, but we have to be kind of careful about this. That's probably not right in the traditional sense in which we understand God, with the traditional attributes, one of which is omniscience. It's very clear that this absolute consciousness is not omniscient in the traditional sense, that there's something unique about this absolute consciousness, this world consciousness, in that it is growing in consciousness. It is coming more and more and more to achieve self-consciousness as time goes on. Hegel's absolute, and here he is going to apply the notion again of this word dialectic. Hegel's absolute is not absolute in the sense of being and having absolutely perfect being. And we can think of that as a kind of preliminary thesis about the absolute. Let's say that our preliminary thesis then is, or a kind of tentative hypothesis about the absolute is, that it is perfect being. And Hegel thinks that there are all kinds of reasons why we can say that it's not that. Well then, if it's not absolute perfect being and it is absolute, maybe it's absolutely perfect non-being. And again, Hegel thinks that there are going to be lots of counterexamples that suggest that it's also not perfect non-being. Well, if it's not this absolute, I'm holding up one hand. This is my left hand. I'll go back here. If it's not the absolute, it's not absolute in the sense of being, and it's not absolute in the sense of non-being, then Hegel suggests then, so, and I missed a step here. The first idea is that we have a thesis, namely that the absolute is perfect being. And to that we find some counterexamples, and we suggest another hypothesis. And that second hypothesis is that the absolute is perfect non-being. And it turns out that the second hypothesis is what we call an antithesis to the first thesis, that the absolute is perfect being. These two are incompatible with each other. Hegel then thinks that there is a progress of understanding, and this is how all progress of understanding and self-consciousness works its way out. We have a thesis, we have some thesis, we have some antithesis, and then we work out a kind of mid-ground, and that pushes us forward into some kind of a synthesis that works out the antagonistic features of the thesis and the antithesis. And then that becomes a new thesis for evaluation and the application of some antithesis to that. So we've got a thesis on the table. The absolute is absolute being. We've got an antithesis on the table. The absolute is absolute non-being, to which we get the synthesis that the absolute is becoming. And this is very important for Hegel. What that suggests is that the absolute is working itself out, is becoming more and more of something. And what Hegel has in mind is that the absolute is becoming more and more and more self-conscious. And the way by which the absolute becomes more and more and more self-conscious is through the actions of collective humanity. What we as humans do with our historic actions causes the cosmic consciousness to become more and more self-conscious in this same kind of a dialectical fashion. And that means in itself that the history for Hegel is going to have this dialectical pattern of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. I think that this is absolutely crucial for understanding Hegel and those other people who are associated with him, but most importantly, it is absolutely crucial for understanding the philosophy of Karl Marx. Now, what Hegel suggests is that the way by which the consciousness works itself out through the actions of history is that each particular age of history has associated with it what he refers to as a Zeitgeist in German, which is a spirit of that particular epoch or age. Now, we can think about this in terms of various generations, the way that we name generations. So we talk about the silent generation and the baby boomers and the Generation Xers and the millennials, and I don't know if there are other ones that we've named. But we certainly think that there is some unique set of a feeling or a set of really not well specified features that the people of this time period share and understand, and Hegel is willing to grant a kind of spiritual status to that set of features that constitute the commonality of that idea. And he thinks that this is how history is going to proceed. We've got one epoch that puts forward a zeitgeist, and that particular spirit of the age is going to constitute a thesis. And then what we're going to have is humans are going to react very strongly in the next generation to the things that had been important to the previous generation. And so we have a zeitgeist that constitutes a thesis. We've got another zeitgeist that constitutes an antithesis. And then what we think is that the next stage of history is going to take into consideration both of these zeitgeists, and is going to work out a synthesis that is going to combine certain elements of both the thesis and the antithesis while getting rid of all the stuff that is contradictory and incompatible. And then that synthesis is going to have, it's going to become the next historical thesis. And of course, then we'll get some antithesis to that, and we'll have a new round of this progressive action. So Hegel thinks, and it's important on this point, Hegel thinks that history is necessarily progressive. And it is, if it's not progressive, then the absolute is unable to come increasingly to acquire self-consciousness. And so it's of necessity that the pattern of history be going forward in some way or another. But it's not linearly forward. It is forward in a corkscrew fashion. We've got this kind of circular motion of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then it takes us to the next circular level, and we've got a kind of corkscrew pattern of progress in history. Okay, now this idea, I think, and I really want to emphasize this idea is absolutely crucial for understanding Marx. Marx is going to drop the spiritual mumbo jumbo, and he is going to claim that history does in fact move in this kind of dialectical fashion of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But he is going to say it's not the spirits of particular ages, which themselves are supposed to be manifestations of some absolute spirit or something like that. Rather, it is the material relations of production that are going to constitute the thesis and the antithesis. And that's going to, in fact, break down into classes. So we're going to have class disputes. We're going to have one class that constitutes giving the thesis, and we're going to have a separate class that's going to constitute giving the antithesis, And hopefully we make progress by having these two classes formulate what we think of as a middle class. The middle class then is going to be something new. It's going to be a synthesis between these two antagonistic classes. And Marx thinks that when we understand the material relations, that is, relations, social relations among human beings about how to produce economic goods, then we're going to understand how to figure out whether or not we're going forward in this kind of corkscrew fashion. So let's talk a little bit about Hegel with respect to how he sees the drivers of human motivation moving history forward. Here's what Hegel cannot get around, and that is that he thinks that human beings really do realistically manifest extraordinary amounts of self-interested behavior. But that self-interested behavior must be understood in certain social contexts. And those social contexts are at different levels. At the lowest level, there is the family. And then above that of the family, there is the community. And then really at the highest level of social organization for Hegel, there is the state. It's worthwhile to consider that Hegel is one of those very rare birds who thinks that we really do need to make room for giving consideration to the family. The family really is an integral part of our understanding of the operation of the whole. But what I want to concentrate here is on the state. The state for Hegel, like I said before, is something that is larger than the individual. And it's not merely that the state has a function of protecting and attending to the needs and the rights of individuals. No, the state is not merely instrumental, but has rather an intrinsic value. It is valuable in and of itself, regardless of its relation to the protection of individuals. And it turns out that the individual is really going to find herself in a position in which she is feeling fulfilled in life when she loses her individual self, so to speak, in something that is larger than herself. And this is a common point for the two system builders, Hegel and Marx. Both of those guys are going to think, look, individuals have been given too much priority in the philosophies of people that have gone by. What we need to think about is ways in which the individual is going to be absorbed in the larger and more important whole. One of these ways is within the state. The state is an instrument in the hand of cosmic consciousness. And as you might have guessed, the state then is going to have the function of being one of the actors in the dialectical process of history. Now, since dialectics are essentially a kind of verbal or logical or maybe actually physical combat, what we can expect is that if states, nation states, are the actors for this kind of dialectical progress, then Hegel's going to have an interesting position with regard to war. War is, for Hegel, absolutely necessary for driving progress forward in the whole scheme of of dialectical progress, war is going to be one component in which we are going to put forward a thesis, and somebody is going to come along with a kind of military antithesis, and we can see that they're going to move to the next stage. This is very interesting, by the way, with respect to some aspects of international relations theory. Some aspects, one particular theory in international relations is the hegemonic war theory. And the hegemonic war theory, as it exists, is sometimes thought to be a modernization of an articulation found in Thucydides. And Thucydides says that what causes the Peloponnesian War is that the Spartans looked at the growing power of the Athenians and it scared them. And so there is a war between the old established power and the new rising power. We can think about this in terms of thesis and antithesis. So the thesis is the established power of Sparta. And then we've got this antithesis, and that is going to be seen as Athens. And they sort of cancel each other out. And then, interestingly, somebody off stage comes along, and after these two have sort of killed themselves in hegemonic war, somebody off stage comes along, namely Philip and Alexander the Great, the Macedonians, and they come along and they become the new power broker. And we might think that, in fact, history can manifest itself in this way, and we have a kind of progress, but that progress is going to require the institution of war. And Hegel is not of the same opinion as Kant that war is simply irrational, and that as we grow in rationality, we're going to ultimately be able to do away with war. That is not Hegel's position. And Hegel is living at a time period in which he is right at the cusp, right at the beginning stages of what we call the Romantic era. And in that Romantic era, we've got a new drive towards nationalism. And Hegel himself is part of that. Not just Hegel, but his two previous predecessors, Fichte and Schelling, see that the position of the Germans is something that is absolutely unique in the world. And it's, of course, something to be proud of, to be part of this nation state, something that's larger than myself as an individual, that is a manifestation of the cultural zeitgeist of my people, not merely the geist, the spirit of the cult spirit of an entire people, the folkgeist, let's say, the spirit of the people is manifest in this nation state. And I think that it's just great. And that's one thesis. The German folkgeist is wonderful. And then here's a kind of new upstart. We can think of the newly formed German world as being, along the lines of the upstart Athens. And really, Germany is somewhat historically in that position. It's only a nation state from, say, the 1860s. Fichte and Schelling, at the time that Fichte and Schelling and Hegel are writing, there really is no Germany. There are a bunch of little German states, and ultimately the wars of German unification, led by this real political genius, Bismarck, is going to unify those to a new powerful state of Germany. Now, at the time, there's a kind of old hegemon on the block, England. We might think that the way that this sort of business is going to manifest itself is that we've got this kind of nation state, old established nation state that has this huge empire, the British, and their nation state has all these colonies that are spread so thoroughly around the world that the sun is said never to set on the British Empire. It is by the time that Germany's coming along, an old established power. So we might think of the British as providing a kind of, in this dialectical understanding of history, a kind of historical thesis. There is a Folkgeist for the British. There is then this other Folkgeist for the newly emergent Germans. And we might think that that is going to lead to a conflict, which of course it does. And not just one conflict, but a conflict that we might think is extended out into two very great conflicts, World War I and World War II, just huge bloodlettings. And then, of course, what ends up happening is that these two powers mutually undermine each other in the same way that, or in a similar way that Sparta and Athens had undermined themselves, and that somebody off stage comes along and becomes the new power, or in the case of, at the end of this conflict, two new folks, the United States and the Soviet Union, sort of outliers in the power arrangement. And so we see that there is a kind of progress, but it's a progress that comes at the price of the tremendous bloodletting of World War I and World War II. And Hegel seems to think that that is an acceptable kind of way of thinking about things, to have a situation in which there is this tendency towards war. So that is Hegel, and in the next of these lectures, I am going to be talking about Marx. So thank you very much.